Hello, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to our monthly sheep and goat webinar. My name is Sarah Jamansky. I'm the Ag and Natural Resource Educator for Purdue University Extension in Perry County, Indiana. And today I'd like to welcome Jason Tower as our guest speaker. Jason is the farm manager for the Southern Indiana Purdue Agricultural Center in DuBois, Indiana. And he has a lot of experience with managed grazing with sheep and goats at the Purdue Research Farm. So I'll just go ahead and turn this over to Jason.
Thank you, Sarah. Appreciate the invite and being a part of your program today. And we'll hit a lot of highlights here on what we do at SciPac with our sheep and goats, and show you some pictures of tools and equipment and kind of some basics of grazing to kind of give you a background and hopefully generate some discussion and points for questions that we can follow up with at the end of the day or even at a later time. Well, with that, just to give you an idea where we're located at, we're SciPac. We're far south here in the northeast corner of DuBois County in southwest Indiana. So that's kind of my perspective of forages and livestock management comes from that area down here in southern Indiana. Just to give you a rough background on what we have and kind of where we've come from, we purchased our first commercial boar influenced goats in the fall of 2004. These were 30 doe kids that we just went to a feedlot that the folks from the University of Kentucky that we worked with on the program early on dealt with. And we just went through and picked out, based on phenotype, boar-looking females that looked like would work. Got them bred up and had our first kids in May of 2005, and that herd has grown and shrunk and grown, but we've kind of settled in and we maintain a herd of 50 kidding females on the meat goats. We have used boar, eco, and Savannah breeding over the years, developed and raised some of our own bucks out of females that have done well for us, both performance and on some parasite tolerant stuff. We got into the hair sheep deal in the fall of 2017. We bought 50 ewe lambs from two different producers, one here in Indiana and one down on the Kentucky-Tennessee line, and then had our first lambs born in May of 2018. And we're kind of holding that flock at 100 or so, plus or minus lambing ewes is where we're at on that. And then we do utilize Shamash for parasite management through the summer months and monitor and keep track of that on those females. All our ewes and does are managed on grass, and they lamb and kid out on pasture, open pasture, starting early May through about mid-June. They mother up, clean up, and we expect them to do what they're designed to do and be good mothers and graze and raise those kids and lambs out on pasture with very little assistance from us. That makes our breeding season is December 1 to January 15th. And we wean those lambs in about 90 to 120 days in August. And we do use managed grazing on everything. We'll get a little more detail into that later. But the sheep I move about every other day, and the goats is more of a 4 or 5 day rotation. Our typical grazing season will run from early April, maybe even by April 1st if we have some winter annual forages to get on. And then, we can get into January most years. I have found, for whatever reason, if I don't supplement the meat goat herd a little bit through lactation with some additional energy, I just cannot keep condition on those does and keep them in good health. So we do supplement them through lactation time. So why manage grazing? Why we want to keep them out there? If we're in control of where the livestock's at, we're going to prevent overgrazing, and that has a lot of positives to the environment and to our pastures, as well as our herd and health issues. That allows longer recovery periods for the forages, and we'll show why that's important after a while. Gives us an opportunity to build organic matter as we knock forage material down through trampling above ground and also below ground as forages are ate. There's a little bit of roots that die off and help build organic matter. There's a potential for higher forage yields. If we are harvesting those pastures several times a year, that's an opportunity for new leaf growth to collect solar energy and continue to grow instead of kind of stalling out and being there as a stale feed. Possible higher quality forage if we're getting in there when we need to and it's not over mature, we're going to have higher quality feed for the animals. I think there's a good possibility of decreased parasite loads, which is particularly important in our small ruminants. We can keep those animals on fresh, clean pasture and also grazing at a higher level off the ground. That's all in our positive management. And there is that possibility for increased animal performance due to higher nutrition and maybe lower parasite issues as we go through. Managed grazing, kind of a term I use in general. If you're looking through magazines, online stuff, there's all kinds of other names that will be thrown out there. Rotational grazing, intensive grazing, management intensive grazing, strip grazing, mob grazing, high stock density grazing, ultra high stock density grazing, and most recently, adaptive multi-paddock grazing. And I really don't get too hung up into those terms, and people ask me, are you doing any of those? And quite honestly, the answer is yes. Depending on the class of livestock we've got, the time of year, a lot of things, we maybe do all of those at some point. And kind of the last term there, that adaptive multi-paddock grazing, if you want to put a name on what we do, that's probably more realistic to what it is. But at the end of the day, these are all improvements over continuous grazing, where we just open the gate and let our animals have access to the same pastures all day long. But at the end of the day, what comes down to those different grazing systems is some different intensities, and I want to spend just a minute talking about stocking rate versus stock density. And it's that stock density term that really kind of differentiates those different grazing techniques or terms that we looked at there early. Stocking rate is the measure of the long-term carrying capacity of the pasture. So, what is that pasture going to support for the entire grazing season? And it really doesn't change too much during the grazing season unless animals are added or removed from the operation. It's going to be what that farm or what that piece of ground can carry on an annual basis. And depending on where you're located, here southern Indiana where we are, that might be 2 acres per animal unit. An animal unit is considered 1,000 pounds of live weight. So you can, back calculate whether you're running pygmy goats or some big old wool sheep or cattle. They all add up to 1,000 pounds somewhere along the line. Get out in the west, maybe it's 75 acres to do that. Stock density is the one that we want to think about, and that's what kind of drives those different grazing terminologies of where we're at. And that's stock density is the number of animals on a given unit of land at any one time. And this is a short-term measurement, and it does change probably with each move into each new grazing area. So stock density, if you're doing a rotational grazing program, if you have 50 acres and on that 50 acres you've got 100 ewes, that over that 50 acres, that's 2 ewes. That's stock density of 2 ewes, or stock rate of 2 ewes per acre. But within your grazing system, you may only give those ewes an acre a day, depending on what kind of forage you have available. So you have all 100 of those on 1 acre. So that stock density is changed to 100 ewes per acre, but that stocking rate for your farm did not change. So that's the thing to keep in mind. And stock density is what drives how hard and how well we utilize either overutilize or underutilize our forage base. I know these are some cattle pictures, but just to drive home the point, these are some different stock densities based on live weight. and the upper left-hand corner is 100,000 pounds of live weight per acre. And you can see here along the fence, they're a little more dense, but they're spread out pretty far back into the pasture. As you move over to the upper right, that's 250,000 pounds of live weight, so much more closely spaced, not as much area for them to move around in. Lower left-hand corner, that's 500,000 pounds per acre. And again, side by side, very tight. And if you get to 1,000,000 pounds an acre, they're coming in there, they're eating everything that's on there. Just some comments on that. Those very extreme densities, that 500,000, 1,000,000 pounds of live weight per acre for sure, and maybe even the 250,000 pounds. You're moving those animals multiple times a day, so they've always got plenty of forage in front of them to go eat. You're not going to achieve that with moving animals every other day or once a week or anything like that. That's multiple times of moving through the day. You got to be sure when you're doing that sort of stuff that you're meeting the goals for the pasture, if you're doing some things there, or for the stock, because you can really affect individual animal performance if you're not careful. And conditions need to be right. You got to have plenty of material for those animals to graze. You got to be willing to move animals several times a day. And even with small ruminants, you get that much weight in a smaller area and it gets wet on us. We can do a lot of damage to the ground that we'll have to deal with for a long time in getting things put back together. Another one just to consider that makes things drive a lot is rest versus recovery. You visit with folks or read magazines, they talk about rest. Rest is just the time between grazing events. So depending on what you're doing, you may have your animals here in one pasture this week, and then 2 weeks move them to the next one, and then come back to where you started 2 weeks. That's 2 weeks of rest. But that's not really allowing that pasture to recover from those grazing events. Now, recovery allows the plant to fully fill the root reserves, so it's getting all that energy back in the roots and building up those carbohydrates. And you got a full set of leaves above ground, so you're fully collecting that sunlight. That way, when that next grazing event does occur, it's able to utilize those root reserves, get a new leaf out there, start photosynthesis, and get you a lot more forage in a hurry. And then recovery time would depend on the plant species, the time of year, and amount of moisture available. In the spring of the year, on cool season, grass-based pastures, fescue like we have here, and that stuff's really growing full gangbusters. Your recovery time might only be 25 or 30 days. But you take that same forage plant and we move into late July or August, temperatures have been running in the 90s, rain is getting scarce. That recovery time might need to be 60 days or 75 days. So it's not a set deal when you can come back. There's a lot of factors that drive that. For us at SciPac and in southern Indiana, our pastures are going to be cool season dominant with grasses and legumes. I would guess most of them are going to be a tall fescue based pasture with some orchard grass. You're probably going to see bluegrass in there. We've seen creeping foxtail come in here in a lot of places. And then our legume part of that, red and white clover. We're been adding bird split trefoil in as another one. And then we've also been trying to incorporate some chicory into those just to give a different forb and something else for those animals to eat. There's a lot of broadleaf weeds that come into our pastures, both cool season and warm season. Some of them can be toxic, and we do need to be very careful with those. Other ones, not so much. And quite honestly, a lot of those have a lot of good nutrition to it. And if given choice, at least the goats here at SciPac would just as soon go after an ironweed and a pigweed, even cockleburs early on before they eat what I'd consider good grass and legumes on there. The sheep, I've noticed, they'll pick around on them, but they don't go after them near like the goats do, and the sheep will tend to graze more similarly to cattle than go around and browse like the goats do. Besides our perennial cool season pastures, we do utilize some summer and winter annuals that we plant, and those summer annuals would be sorghum Sudan grass, pearl millet. They're going to be a C4 type plant that really likes the heat and humidity, can deal with some drier times, but can put a lot of high quality forage on in a short amount of time. And the goats and sheep do like those, are able to graze more upright in a browsing situation and keep them up there away from where the parasites are. And then come fall and winter time, we can look into some cool season annual type things. A mix that we like to use here would be spring oats, some turnips, some cereal rye, some annual ryegrass. The turnips and the spring oats will give you a tremendous amount of grazing in the fall of the year. And when I've been able to, I'll kind of use that ahead of breeding time, just to up nutrition a little bit going into breeding season without having to pack feed to them. Energy level and the bulbs on these turnips can be something similar to corn. Crude protein levels can exceed 30% in the leaves on the turnips. Very highly digestible, almost to a fault that you need to have some other additional dry matter in there, some coarser feed, whether that be some dry hay, or that's where the oats components come in and balance that diet out. And we can even get to where we get some snow cover, and as long as those girls know there's good feed out there, they'll move that snow out of the way and keep on grazing and get along just fine. Browse is something that we may oftentimes not consider, other than it's something we don't necessarily want. But if you have a lot of goats around, man, what I've seen, this is where they would love to be anytime they can. It's a kind of a natural grazing position for them. If they can be eating at their head level or above, I believe they're happier. The way their mouth is designed with teeth top and bottom, and they've got lips that can grab stuff. They can get high quality selective leaves off a lot of places that other animals wouldn't eat, whether it's got thorns on it. It can be very, very high quality feed, great resource. Help us with our parasite management in the summertime. Can get us to an area that maybe we haven't had small ruminants on, so there's not a parasite load there to be picking up, and help break that parasite cycle. And then if you've got woods that you're trying to manage and regenerate some hardwoods, it's being shaded out by some invasive species. These goats in particularly will really do us a lot of good in that situation. Just a couple sets of examples here for you. This first photo is a picture of a pond dam here at SciPac. You can see in the background there, it's some multiflora rose, some autumn olive, probably some bush honeysuckle on there, on a pretty steep slope on a dam that you can't get with mechanical equipment. But underneath all that brush, there's no light getting there, so it is pretty much bare soil. And we were starting to see some erosion issues there because there wasn't root matter to hold all that. So we fenced that off with some temporary fencing, turned the goats in there, and in a matter of days, you can just see how much they've opened that up. And we did that over a course of several years, and the grasses came back in, and we've stabilized that. So we've completed several goals using those goats in this grazing program. I got rid of some stuff that we didn't want, and got to where we could do some mechanical stuff, hand work, but then also provide a good feed for the animals. Here's another example. This is in some hardwood forest here at the farm. This is multiflora rose in the understory. Very dense, as you can see. Stuff's approaching 3 feet, some of it 4 there in the background. You kind of lose sight of the measurement stick there on how dense that is. Compare that here with this is the same spot, look at that same measuring stick. In a matter of days, they've opened that up to where it's now easy to control with some hand work or some herbicide application. And so we did a positive thing for our woods management, provided a good feed resource to the animals, and gave them a break from where parasite loads might be. The thing that makes a lot of this grazing stuff work is quality fence material. So we'll spend a little time going through some options there. Your exterior fence, you need to make sure it's appropriate for the class of livestock that you've got. Fence that I can keep cattle in here with. Sheep and goats will laugh at me and walk out wherever they want to. Is predator control an issue that you need to deal with? That might determine what you want. And most of what we use for exterior fence, I guess all of what we use is either woven wire or high tensile wire with the sheep and goats. Woven wire comes in many different forms and fashions. We're going to give you 3 examples of kind of what I've settled on. This first one here is a hinge joint woven wire, so it kind of gives and follows the lay of the land a little bit. And it's what they call a 7/26/6. So you'll see that on woven wire fence. What that means, there's 7 horizontal wires. It's 26 inches high, and then it's a 6-inch horizontal spacing here on your wires. And this one is actually graduated. It's 6 inches at the top, and it gets down to 2 on the bottom there. I've liked it so far. It's easy to put up. We can modify existing fence with that relatively easy to contain our sheep and goats, and it's small enough that we're not getting goats stuck through there. You will notice with it only being 26 inches and knowing we do run cattle and other stuff in it, we will run a single hot wire over the top of this just to keep the cattle from rubbing on it. And so far, the spacing is tight enough. We have not had issues with animals sticking their head through and getting caught. But that is an issue if you've got horned goats. Some of the first woven wire we started using was what they called a sheep and goat mesh. It's a 4 by 4 inch spacing on these holes here. So an adult animal cannot get their head through there. Kids can. It is a 48-inch high fence. Very tight, worked well. But with that much wire, it is quite a bit more expensive per foot than the previous one I showed you. Another one we've tried and have got along with it, we've used it where we're grazing more sheep than anything else, is this 7/35/6. It's what they call a fixed joint woven wire, and what that allows you to do, it's a little stiffer. You can spread your posts out a little bit farther if you're on some flatter ground. And this happens to be 6-inch spacing at the top. I think it gets down to 5 at the bottom. And we have not had problems yet with anything getting their head caught in that. We have some of this in a pen that we built for the rams and bucks, and we did run a hot wire on the inside where animals have access to about 20 or 24 inches off the ground, just so they can't rub on it and maybe keep their head out of it. But these have worked real well for us. And then another thing we've done, and as long as we can keep it hot, has worked well, is high tensile fence. It goes up easy. This particular fence is 28 inches tall, and that's not much. We have had no issues with our animals jumping that. They tend to want to put their head down and go through things. So this fence has got 8 wires on a 2-inch spacing. Top wire, the middle wire here are hot all the time, and we've got a lower wire we can shut on and off if need be. And these wires are pulled very tight with a relatively close post spacing, so there's not a whole lot of give that they can't get their head started through that. And that has worked for us well, but it does have to be electrified. It does need to be tight, and it does need to be hot. And when I'm talking hot, I'm talking about the voltage on the fence from your fence charger. For the goats, we need to be seeing 3,000 volts or more on that all the time, or they will challenge it or slip through it. They just don't seem to feel that shock at a lower level than that. The sheep seem to be less challenging to a fence and more respectful at a lower level. If I could keep the fence at 5,000 or better all the time on the goats, would save some headaches, because they do want to slip through from time to time if that voltage drops down. So now we're going to talk about some interior fencing, and this is what's going to allow us to create subdivisions and paddocks and really manage our grazing and small paddocks and longer rest periods and watch residual heights in and out. Depending on how you're set up, it might be a temporary or a permanent fence. Some of our existing pastures were a little larger than I wanted, so I did make some permanent subdivisions in them. This happens to be 4 high tensile wires with the top and third one from the top hot. There's a bottom wire down there that's kept really tight. And as long as we keep those hot, We don't have too much problems. No problems with the sheep, not too much problems with the goats slipping through there. But if it does lose some voltage, they will slip through there. And again, this is electric. And the type of your interior fence is going to be somewhat dependent on the personality of your animals, how respectful they are of electric fence, and how curious as they are. These are some photos I got from Aaron Walker. He's a sheep producer in Washington County, and he is able to use polywire fence on his sheep flock to make his subdivisions. And he came up with a real ingenious way, I thought, to make a multi-wire fence for those girls. And what he's doing is uses a single reel like we'd use in cattle. He made him a post here, and he'll pull this out. The sponge acts like a brake, so the wheel doesn't freewheel when he pulls that out. So he'll hook one end of the fence on the bottom, his reel up here, and then he'll walk across the field with this other hook and this carabiner and pull across the field. Once he gets across, he'll go back, put his temporary step-in post here in that's got multiple hooks, and set those wires, and he gets along really well that way with that fence. I've not been so fortunate. Our sheep, I think, would be all right with that. Our goats would still walk through that too easily. So we tend to use electric netting everywhere, both to keep the goats where we want and sheep where we want, but also it acts as our predator control. So the netting comes in 164 feet or 82-foot rolls. So it'll, depending on your pasture, it'll obviously take you several to get across. You can get several different heights. I found I like the 35-inch height. I can step across it without too much problem. It's not so tall. It's hard and heavy to deal with. I bought some 48-inch to try, and it really gets a lot more cumbersome to deal with. And then on the vertical stays here that keep it stabilized, some manufacturers will use a heavy plastic vertical stay. Some of them just use the polywire. I like the plastic. It gives the fence a little more rigidity. It stands up a little bit better. You don't have to pull it so tight to keep it standing upright. And again, this is an electric psychological deal. It needs to be hot all the time and every minute of the day. The goats particularly, I could just move them, and if this isn't on, that could be the same grass on the other side of the fence 15 minutes later, something will invariably stick their head through there and want to eat on it. If it's not hot, then they, with their horns, they get hung up in it and creates a heck of a mess for you. So it needs to be hot all the time. I've said that many times, but that is a point that you need to keep in mind. Here's another shot of this netting from this spring. And what I wanted to show here, as we get further into the grazing season and you're kind of finishing up your first rotation maybe for the year, the forages are getting a little more mature on us. This fescue's throwing seed heads up, and it's getting a little stiffer with the lignin in there. It gets hard to put this fence in. It doesn't want to stay, and it kind of wants to lay it over. So every one of these horizontal lines is hot. And as it's laying here in the grass, when you get the dew on, that's creating a lot of ground out issues, and it'll really pull the power down on your fence and could get to a point where it drowns it out all the way, and the goats will start pushing on it. So what we do this time of year is we'll come in just with a lawnmower and mow a path where that fence is going to go. And I may mow a path for 3 or 4 moves, one day, and that'll take care of me for a week or two. And then we'll do it again as we need to. But that keeps the fence hotter. It's easier to put up. Also, I've noticed it gives the kids a place to walk around in the short grass, and they seem to appreciate that, not try to fight their way through that tall stuff and worry about the predators that they think's hiding out there in the tall grass. This is just a reminder for me. Not too long after we got goats, we had a gentleman here that for meeting or something, I don't remember why, but he was a neat guy, and he said, well, you do know how you check a fence to make sure it'll hold goats, don't you? And I said, no, and I'm always willing to learn. And he said, well, you go build your fence the way you want it. Go get you a 5-gallon bucket of water and throw at it. And if any water gets through, there's a good chance a goat will too. So that's there again, a little bit of an exaggeration, but keep in mind that if you're using this kind of fence, it needs to be goat tight. And whether that's through the right woven wire or hot electricity, That's very, very important. But here's how we actually do it. This is a digital voltmeter fault finder. There's several brands out there. This will tell you what your voltage is on the fence. So this says 6.7 kilovolts, so that's 6,700 volts. So that's good and hot. That's going to keep them where we want. You can also hit the button up here, and if there's a short on it, it'll tell you which way the short is and how much it is. So if you've got much electric fence around, these are a great tool to have with you to find that sort of stuff. To make this rotational grazing deal work, you're going to have water available in lots of different spots. And we're fortunate here in southern Indiana, we can do a lot of stuff with temporary water. This is just a small 30-gallon tank with a float valve on it, and a garden hose, and then right underneath the fence in the middle of the field, we've got a black poly line we just laid down there. And from April through November, we can run that, not worry about freezing. We've got multiple plug-ins, so we can put our division fences in where we want. We've got these quick couplers every few hundred feet and a 50-foot garden hose, so we're very flexible on where our watering location is, and we can change that each time so we're not beating up the same spot, but always provide good fresh water for our grazing animals. So our grazing management here at SciPac, I mentioned early on, the sheep are moved every 2 or 3 days. More often it's every 2 days. And they work really well. They herd up nice. The lambs stay with the ewes, even at a day or two old, and move right along. So we don't have any issues, even here during lambing season. The goats, not so much. I only move them every 4 or 5 days, and that's mostly due to those kids just don't stick with the does as tight, and the does are more interested in going and getting something to eat than making sure the kids are coming with them. And it really seems like the goats pick a spot in every paddock that's kind of their home base, and everybody beds down there, and that's where the kids want to stay, and just don't want to leave that area. And it's really hard to drive them. I tell people you could take 10 goats and try to drive them. With only 10 goats, they'll go 15 directions all at the same time, and you throw some young kids in there, it's kind of the same deal. So to kind of avoid that aggravation until those kids kind of get 45 or 60 days old, then they kind of get with the program. But here early on, we do a little slower rotation with them. And what we'll do is we will set that netting up for our division fences. I'll open up a section of that and leave it open, fold it back out of the way, make it hot. And by the second day after I've done that, those kids are used to going back and forth, and they're pretty well gone all and moved, and they're easy to move that second day. And then everybody's kind of together there in that same paddock for a couple of days, and then we'll repeat the deal. We try to leave it pretty tall residual height, so the height of the forage when we leave, and that's to help with parasite management. If we can continuously graze, I'd like to say 6 inches or above. That reduces the parasite intake, because they got to stay in the dew droplets, and those larvae move with where the dew's at, and that tends to be lower from the ground. 4 inches is okay, but you get below that, you're really adding to your parasite problem. And then we do like a long recovery period, probably a little too long for proper forage quality, but I think that longer rest period maybe helps with breaking some management cycles, that longer recovery period, and you get quicker regrowth after that. So we're probably at least 45 days on all our small ruminant pastures, and oftentimes 60 days between grazing events on those. Just a little bit on plants. Plants are really just a solar panel and an energy storage unit. So the leaves here are our solar panels. That's what's collecting our energy from the sun. And then through the process of photosynthesis, it's driven down into the root zone. And then that energy is stored down here in the roots. So when our grazing event occurs and we take the top part of these plants off and don't have the surface area to collect the sun, we draw energy out of those root reserves to put those new leaves out, and then recreate the process. And really on this grazing deal, kind of what was my aha moment was back in the late 90s, I went to the Grazing School in Missouri and was getting into this stuff. And they were talking about the amount of forage that you see above ground is very similar to the amount of root mass you have below ground. And if we think about that, if we're in an overgrazed pasture situation and we start to get into dry times, look how quickly that turns brown versus, under the fence that's not grazed maybe. And these pictures here, kind of show that. On the left-hand side, this set of plants was cut to 2 inches every week. So that simulates, continuous grazing. This one was cut to 2 inches every 2 weeks. You can see a little more root mass, a lot more leaf. And this is more like what we'd want to do, other than 2 inches is short, but it kind of drives home the point that, every 30 days, this was cut to a 2-inch height. Look how much more root mass we have, more resilience when we get to dry weather, find some moisture. All this leaf area is going to keep the ground covered, keep it cooled, and just really make a healthier pasture for you. This upper right-hand picture is the same sort of thing, but with some warm season grasses. Again, from the left to right, flip short often to proper rest and recovery. Just look at the difference in the roots that you see there. So that's really what we're trying to get done from a plant standpoint in our grazing management, is harvest what we can without detrimenting root growth. Part of keeping all that together is knowing where your soil's at, getting a good soil sample, and adding proper nutrients as needed. If you just put out the same fertilizer every year, because that's what we've always done, you're probably wasting money and doing things you don't need to. Proper soil sample, 6 inches deep, selected randomly across the field, avoid winter feeding areas and things like that. Send those off to a lab, county extension, or local co-op can help get you to that right place. And then design the fertility program to meet your soil needs. If you take it into a co-op somewhere and they come back and tell you that you need 200 pounds of 12-12-12, I would guess that they're wrong and just don't want to study and help. So, and the last statement here, correct your pH issues first. If you've got something that's really low on pH, as this lower picture here shows, if you're down in the 5s, there may be nutrients that are there, but they're not available. So we need to add lime, get that up over 6 to 7, and all those nutrients that are in the soil become available. Well, things work much, much better. This chart here, just to show, goes back. I kind of got these two out of order. I apologize for that. When we're thinking about our grazing, you've probably heard the old adage, take half and leave half of what's out there. And that's based on this. So there on the left-hand side, if we take 50% or less of the leaf area off the top of that plant, the root stoppage is only going to be 4% or less. So roots are going to continue to grow, going to continue to pull in moisture, going to continue to pull in soil nutrients to put into those leaves for the animals. If we take off 60% of that leaf material, we're going to lose 50% of those roots, and that root growth stops, and they're going to slough off. And the shorter we graze, the worse it gets. And I think it's important that we keep some good grazing records. That's we're not making hay where we can count how many bales we took off or anything like that. We're not shelling corn. We don't know how many bushels we are, but we can get some pretty good estimates of yield based on the number of animals we have out there and how long they're grazing. So I'd want to know how many animals are in the herd. When did we turn them into each pasture or paddock? When did they come out? So we know the days. Keep track of the weather because that can affect production. But then based on the animal weight, we can get an estimate of forage production out there. And these records don't have to be anything fancy. It can just be pencil and paper that you keep over the years and do a summary. I do a lot of mine in an Excel spreadsheet and do some calculations automatically based on formulas there. And there are some awfully nice purchase programs depending on how big or acreage you want to cover. Pasture Map is one that we're using. Graze is another nice one that will help predict some animal performance. You can put some pasture data in there, and it'll predict pasture growth for you based on data that you provide. So just gives you a nice management tool to do some forage forecasting on when you might be short of forage. So with that, I'm going to end on this picture, Sarah, and we'll answer questions if there are any, and go from there.
Thank you very much, Jason. That was a great presentation. I know I really appreciated it. If anyone has any questions, you can type them in the chat box. Now we do have some questions in the Q&A, so we'll go ahead and take a look at those. Okay, so one question, is this presentation available for future reference? Yes, I have recorded this presentation, so it will be available on my YouTube channel. I will, because of the holiday weekend, it will be posted on Tuesday to my YouTube channel. Okay, and some questions for Jason. Do you have spring bloat concerns?
Repeat the question, please.
Do you have concerns with spring bloat?
Oh, bloat. No, we have not. If you have a white clover dominant pasture, it can be. If you're not careful, alfalfa can do that too, but we don't have that high of a percentage of clover in our pastures. If you do happen to have that, some management things you can do, keep some dry feed out there for them. Make sure the pasture is dry from dew before you move them. Don't let the animals be hungry when you move them, because they'll selectively graze that higher quality stuff first. And then there's some bloat guards, some chemical stuff I know from a cattle standpoint that you can put out there. I'm not sure if it's a labeled thing for sheep and goats, but where we do have plenty of legumes in there, if you're moving consistently and moving those animals on time, we have had no issues with bloat.
Thank you very much. Someone, they also asked, what is the recommended amount of portable fencing?
I'm not sure what they mean is the amounts you need is going to be pasture dependent. If you've got 50 acres and nothing inside, it's going to take a lot of pasture a lot of linear feet to get across that pasture. If you've subdivided that with a permanent subdivision and are using an example, we tried to put in a permanent subdivision where I can get by with 2 or less rolls of that electric netting. So that would be 320 feet. So if you're going to do that, if you've got one group of animals in this example and you're going to make paddocks, you're going to need enough netting to have the paddock for the animals where they're at, plus make your next move. So in this situation, if it takes 2 rolls of netting to get across the paddock, it's going to take you 4 rolls of that netting to make the paddock that they're in. And then you'll need 2 additional rolls to make the new paddock for the next move. And then you pick up the old, and then you have your move for the second. So in that example, you need 6 rolls of netting, but every pasture and situation is going to be a little bit different on quantity of fence needed.
Thank you. Someone asked, can you repeat the planted summer annuals? I think she wants the list repeated of what summer annuals you use.
Oh, sure. Sorghum Sudan grass is the base one that we use more often than not. That's just a fast growing grass. Pearl millet is another one that can be used. Some folks will use grain sorghum or forage sorghum would be others. And there are some brassicas or turnips that can be planted in the summer. And also some field peas would be one that folks have used. And then in the fall and winter, it's typically for us is a mix of spring oats, turnips, annual ryegrass, and cereal rye is what we'll use.
Okay, is 35 inches enough for stock dogs, or does it just depend?
I'll be real honest, I have 0 experience with stock dogs. We've either got dumb predators or dumb luck or something. We just use that netting to keep. We've got coyotes on the farm and fox and stuff, and so I cannot speak on guard animals.
Are you moving to a barn at night every day, or do you use a portable shelter?
They have no shelter. They just they're out in it. So yep, they're out on grass 24/7.
Do you have any methods to get water to them when it's freezing?
Most of our pastures are set up to where we have one winter-proof watering spot, and the nice thing at that point is that pastures are not regrowing, so I do not worry about a back fence. So I'll let them walk across where they've already grazed to get to water, which makes it nice, and they'll spend the majority of their time on the stockpile there. If we're grazing some annuals, quite honestly, we just pack water to them as needed. And I know for us in Southern Indiana, that's going to work most of the time. If you're in another part of the country where you have real winter, I know it'll be a challenge.
So we've never really had a pasture management plan. So where's the best place to start for a complete newbie?
If you're not doing anything June 4th and 5th, or depending on where you're at, here at SciPac, we're having a grazing school. You can find information. There's one up at Rossville, Indiana, the following weekend. Indiana NRCS has a lot of nice publications on getting started in grazing management. YouTube's not a bad place to look either. And, feel free to contact me. I'd be glad to visit with you as well.
So how tall do you let pasture grow before cutting it down to 6 inches and allow to regrow?
This is another one of those you'll find in grazing management. There's not a lot of yes and no kind of answers. Spring of the year, it might be 25 or 30 days where that grass has got 12, 14 inches of growth on it. And there again, that's dependent on the species of grass. So you can't hold that as a hard and fast deal. But we get July to August, early September, and the rains are short. It may take 60 days to get enough regrowth on that to be considerate. So, if I was forced to put a number on it, I'd say at least 30 days, and more often than not, if you want to be safe, probably 45 days. But again, remember, it is species dependent and time of year dependent.
Okay, there's 2 questions from the same person. How many grazing acres, and do you run the goats behind the sheep, or do they follow each other?
Okay, the goats are, right now we keep everything separate, and that's more just of an ease of management on my part for moving and grazing the way I want to. But the 50 goats that we have are running on about 11 acres, and then that's subdivided many, many, many times. And the 100 ewes are probably on 15 or 16 acres most of the time. And then the fall of the year, they may get moved. Fall, I'm talking maybe December and January on some stockpile place we grew elsewhere. But the majority of the grazing season, 16 or 17 acres.
Okay, a related question. Do you graze the small ruminants and cattle in the same pastures? If so, do you graze them together, or if not together, which species do you graze through a pasture first?
My goal is to get a large number of our pastures set up that will hold the small ruminants, so that 7/26/6 woven wire fence that I talked about earlier, I want to put that on. Honestly, a lot of our cattle pastures are just too high tensile wires, and that will not hold sheep and goats. What I have done in a few places where we do have run them together, it might be a 10-acre pasture. That perimeter fence is good enough to hold the sheep and goats. I will let them kind of go where they want, but then I will do more of a management on the cattle. and use a single high tensile wire or poly wire and temporary fence to hold them in smaller paddocks and keep them where I want. When I've done that, it has been with the goats, and I let the goats kind of roam that whole 10 acres and let them choose out all those broadleaf weeds that the cattle aren't going to work. So then the goats are short enough, they'll slip underneath the poly wire to come into water and things like that. But it's pretty amazing when we've done it. They don't really mix too much. They kind of stay in their own herds and stuff. But if I had the fence that I could keep the sheep and goats in, I would do more grazing together, but we just haven't got to that point yet from an infrastructure standpoint.
And then somebody asked, do they have shade? Which I think you answered that with you don't have any kind of shelter in those.
There is some shade, shade here and there, depending on where they're at in the pasture and what pasture they're in, but not always. If we get into a spell where it's going to be 95 every day for 10 days, I'll try to make some laneways or something to some shade. But if it's just going to be kind of one hot day here and there, I don't worry too much about it.
And then what is your typical goat per acre stocking rate?
We're probably 6 to 8 is where we're at on the goats and the sheep both.
Then have you considered rotating cattle ahead of the goats to control parasites?
Considered it, not done it for various reasons of cattle on different projects and not having quite the freedom to do that. But I do know that is would be a good management practice if I could always make all the calls I wanted to.